Margaret Atwood plays around with language a lot in The Handmaid's Tale, which I think, as dark as this book can be, makes reading it a lot of fun. And obviously, Offred is somebody who's very literate, who likes to think about words, who likes to think about double meanings of words and kind of roll words around in her mind. I think it's no coincidence that Offred and the commander play Scrabble, and that even playing Scrabble is so off limits, is so taboo, that Offred really relishes the words and the letters. So Margaret Atwood creates these new words. Some of them are really obvious. You can tell which two words she's combining. Neo means new and logos means speech or word. She also uses portmanteau words, which are words that combine two different things, like smog, smoke and fog combined makes smog, or broflake, like bro, and snowflake combined makes broflake. There are also a lot of euphemisms. A euphemism is some sort of term that makes something sound prettier or more palatable, right? Like saying passed away instead of died. If you've read 1984, George Orwell's dystopian novel, you might know about Newspeak, which is a euphemism used by people in power to confuse or to deceive the public, to deceive the population. So Margaret Atwood uses a lot of these words in the text. So colonies, that's not a new word, but the way that the colonies, or what the colonies represent, what happens in the colonies, is very different than you would expect. So a colony is some sort of satellite of a country that's meant to increase numbers or create a new society. You might even think of a colony on Mars, or a colony of bacteria, right? It's meant to reproduce, as problematic as that can be. But in Gilead, people are sent to these colonies to go to die, right? They are sent to the colonies when they've done something wrong, when they're heretics, according to this society. People like Offred's mother get sent to the colonies. They end up digging up toxic sludge, and they basically just go there to die and to never be heard from again. So the colonies are sort of the opposite of what we would expect. So not really a new word, but it's being used differently. Unwomen. So it's obvious what unwoman refers to, a woman who isn't really a woman. So it tells you exactly what it is that the people in power in Gilead admire or value when it comes to women. So women who are sterile when they're not supposed to be, like handmaids, feminists or hostile to the regime, or just no longer useful in Gilead, are referred to as unwomen or unwomen. So their femininity, or who they are, their identity, is stripped from them. It's almost as if they're calling them an unperson, right? Which means nothing at all. You cease to exist. So this is an example of a word, women, but that it includes a prefix to make it a new word. Liber Theos. So we don't have that much information in the text about Liber Theos. Remember, Offred is just trying to figure out things herself. She's trying to figure out exactly what happened. A lot of this is kept secret. She gets very limited glimpses of the outside world, right? So we, since we're reading this from Offred's perspective, since she's the narrator, we're also in the dark until we get a little bit more information when we read the historical notes at the end of the text, which are actually a part of the novel itself. But liber makes you think of liberty, which means freedom, theos or theology, meaning God. And we know that somewhere in Central America is the Liber Theos Society. So it could be that this is a country or a group of people who are committed to religious freedom, which would sort of be ironic given that that's how the United States supposedly, or was supposed to have been. That was the whole purpose of the United States, right? People seeking religious freedom. That's the idea, at least. Or they could be people fighting for religious freedom. We know that in Gilead, it's not just Christians who are considered correct or morally right. Certain branches of Christianity, like Catholicism or even Quakers, are considered heretics. So it's not just that in Gilead they're Christian. They're a very specific, perverted version of Christianity, which many people would say isn't even Christianity at all. Right? They're Christian in name only. Particicution. So that's a combination of participate and execution. So it's a public lynching, and the handmaids actually participate in it. You might think about why that is. As a tool of maintaining power, why is it that the regime would want the handmaids to participate in this? Maybe it's so that they can get out their own rage and frustration at their lot in life or at the regime, but channel it into a way that the regime finds productive. Maybe it's as a warning, or maybe it's to remind them that they are complicit in this, right? By holding the rope or by tearing someone limb to limb, they get out their own rage, they place it somewhere else. They don't take out their rage on the people who they should really have rage against, but instead they sublimate it. Portmanteau words, I already mentioned, and Newspeak, and also just any sort of new word or hybrid or combination of words, I think make this novel lots of fun to read. Let's talk about Aunt Lydia and the narrator's mother. So it might seem like a strange question. How are the two women similar? They seem totally opposite, right? At least they're on opposite sides of the cultural and political spectrum. But there are some ways in which they're similar. So the narrator's mother is much more likable and sympathetic than Aunt Lydia. I think it would be a huge mistake, and it's pretty obvious to see that Margaret Atwood is not suggesting that Aunt Lydia and the narrator's mother are equally bad, right? Aunt Lydia is pretty terrible, and the narrator's mother is still likable. The narrator still misses her and still values her, even though they had a strained relationship. So this is not to say that the two women are equally bad at all. I think it's pretty clear that Margaret Atwood is suggesting that Aunt Lydia is worse and that her version of fundamentalism or extremism is much more dangerous and toxic. But both of them are extremists in some way. I think Aunt Lydia is more extreme than the narrator's mother, but they're both relatively extreme. Aunt Lydia is if I can use this term, a radical conservative. So she's conservative, but in this very extremist, dangerous way. When she's indoctrinating the handmaids at the Red Center, she shows them images, pornographic images, and also images of protests, of feminist protesting back when Gilead was the United States, to say, look how terrible things used to be. So after Aunt Lydia shows them these pornographic or violent images, or these images of women protesting, she says, consider the alternatives. You see what things used to be like. That's what they thought of women then. So I think what makes this regime of Gilead so terrifying but also so effective is they take a kernel of truth, right? That women actually, when Gilead was the United States, would have bad things happen to them, or they would be exploited, or they would be sexualized. She takes that kernel of truth, but she uses it to justify this entirely new, much, much more repressive and terrifying system. So she uses a kernel of truth to justify her system in the same way that they use a quotation from the Bible about Rachel and Leah, but they pervert it and twist it and use it to justify their own ideology and their own plan. Offred's mother, similarly, but on the total opposite side of the spectrum, when Offred's younger, she takes her to a burning of pornographic magazines. And the women and men who are burning these magazines seem really delighted to watch the magazines burn. They almost are described like zealots, right? They're so excited to see these magazines burn, and they're encouraging Offred to throw magazines into the fire. Offred catches a glimpse of one of the women in the magazine, but instead of thinking that the woman is being exploited, to her young, kind of innocent, childlike mindset, she thinks the woman looks like Tarzan, which I think is interesting because Tarzan, you think of like the king of the jungle, he's powerful, and the nakedness isn't so much exploitation as it is a sign of power or virility. Again, this is from Offred's childhood innocent perspective, but still both her mother and Aunt Lydia have extreme views on women, but obviously on totally different sides, right? Offred's mother, is she too extreme? What do you think? I think from our perspective, at least 2020 perspective, she doesn't seem all that extreme. She does say some things about men like they're useless or who needs them, but I think part of this is to sort of gig or to kind of humor Offred's husband, Luke. We know that when Offred's mother is drinking, she and Luke like to kind of banter. They're sort of fighting, but they also love each other at the same time. Luke says misogynistic things, but sort of to irritate his mother-in-law on purpose because they're kind of having fun with each other, and vice versa. So it's hard to tell how serious Offred's mother is when she says things like, oh, men, who needs them? They have pretty eyes, but who cares? If she's being totally serious, or if it's a defense mechanism, or if she's sort of kidding around, but there's a kernel of truth to what she's saying. They're also both judgmental of Offred. Offred is imperfect. She says that she didn't go to protests, that she sort of let things happen to her, that she decided to turn off the news and not see what was going on and instead channel her attention into baking, into her home life. So Offred is not exactly some powerful feminist icon, right? She's just sort of a normal, flawed human being. But both Aunt Lydia and her mother say that Offred and women in her generation are a transitional generation in totally different ways, right? Offred's mother says that Offred is a flash in the pan, that Offred being a little bit more traditional and being married and enjoying a home life, things like that, and maybe not appreciating all of the lengths that feminists before her went through to make sure that she had rights like being able to work and own property and things like that. She says that Offred is sort of a backlash, that she's a little bit retro with her traditional family. But Offred's mother, or the Aunt Lydia, says that Offred is a transitional generation in a very different way, right? She says future generations of handmaids will not struggle so much because they won't have known their previous lives, right? The same way that Offred struggles a lot because she existed in a world where she lived like a normal human being and had freedoms and was married, right, and had control over her own money and her own job and her own body and her own child. So as different as they may seem, right, they're on totally different ends of the political spectrum. They're both pretty extreme and they're both pretty judgmental. But I think it's really important to emphasize here that Margaret Atwood, at least to me and to most readers, seems much more critical of the extreme right than she does of the extreme left.